Hey guys, my name's Crystal Kenny, and I'm in love with creating. All things artistic and imagination involved. I'm an American girl who chased her creative dreams all the way to Paris, France, making a living using photography. This podcast takes you inside the stories of all the artsy folks I've met along the way and gives you that extra push to discover your creative gifts. The desire to create is deeply inside each and every one of us, and I give you the tools and inspiration to find a new way of living a more creative life. This is La Vie Creative, the podcast. Claudine Hemingway is a descendant of famed writer Ernest Hemingway. We bumped into each other at a party and decided to team up and dive deep into French history, but with a twist, by bringing a spotlight to those lesser-known creatives in France. This is History with a Hemingway. Welcome back to Paris History avec a Hemingway. I'm back with Claudine, and we are talking about Marie Laurencin, and I have no idea who she is, so Claudine's going to teach us all about this fascinating woman today.
Yeah, she is one that, probably not a lot of people will know about. You might know some of her love life people that she had in her, but she was an artist, but I actually kept coming across her in museums, and I actually thought that these paintings were somebody else. And then I kept this last fall, I kept seeing them, and I was like, what is this? Who is this? And then that's what kind of started me down the road. And then I thought, well, I'll just share it with everybody now.
Well, now we're learning from you wondering. We like that.
Yes. Well, that's usually how all these things happen. And then the rabbit holes that I went down in researching her, it took me to there's about 5 more people we're going to talk about down the road in other episodes just because of her, which is what happens. But Marie Laurencin was born on Halloween Day in 1883 in Paris. Her mother, Pauline Melanie Laurencin, she was Creole, and she was an embroiderist, and she never knew who her father was until late in her life. It's believed that her father was a politician named Alfred Toulet, but she didn't have anything to do with her father. She never really even knew him. And I think this actually came out it could have been after she actually died that somebody actually figured out who her father was. But when she was very young, she showed that she had a lot of talent drawing. And her mother was not happy about this. She discouraged this because, even now, if somebody's like, I want to be an artist, and it's like, oh, parents probably just growed, like they're going to be living with me forever.
You don't want to make it money.
Yeah.
Like if they said a doctor.
Yeah. So in 1901, she was just 18 years old. She enrolled in a school at the Sévres, which was, as we know, they're known for their porcelain. And so she actually enrolled there to be a painter. And so if you see a lot of this pottery, you could see some of this in the States. Of course, you see a lot of it in Paris, but it's like these beautiful, plates with maybe a scene in the center of it and beautiful flowers around the edge. Well, those were all hand done by artists. Oh, wow. And that's exactly how Renoir started as well. Renoir started as being, training to be a painter of, these beautiful pieces of porcelain. So she started doing that. At night, she would take drawing classes at the Hôtel de Ville in Batignolles, and where she also learned how to do engraving as well. So she was basically like soaking up anything she possibly could, learning how to be an artist. So in 1902, the next year, she started at the Humbert Academy, which was on Boulevard de Clichy. And there she was, her fellow artists were Georges Braque and Francis Picabia. And so she was basically, everybody knows Georges Braque. Well, most people know Georges Braque, at the time of Picasso and the Cubanism. And so she was just basically training alongside all these other people. Of course, these names to us now, we know these names. But back then it was just, Joe and Shirley.
Shirley.
They were just their fellow student. They didn't become the people that we know. They weren't as huge when they first started, of course. But, they all encouraged her. They really encouraged her to explore her art, even though her mother was not happy about this. She lived with her mother She lived with her mother for quite some time, and her mother was constantly just against everything. But in 1904, she met, through Georges Braque, Henri Pierre Rocher. And Rocher was a writer and he was an art collector, and he also worked as an art broker from time to time. And that was the same year that she met through him Picasso.
Ah.
So Picasso was very young at this point. I mean, he just came in 1900 to Paris, and so he had only been here for a few years. At first, he went back and forth to Spain. So, in 1904, he was basically, at that point set up in Paris. So he basically, invited her over to the Bateau Lavoir. And, this is when he was known for, the blue period and then the rose period. And so, she basically was kind of like a part of this inner circle with him and Max Jacob and Apollinaire. So she, was hanging around, and she, as a woman, kind of like was able to get into these groups that most women couldn't get into.
Ah, it's because of her connections.
Yeah, and because they definitely saw very early on that she definitely was very talented. She definitely, knew what she was doing. And so, she was actually starting when she started, she did have a bit of Cubanism in her paintings. It wasn't to the point of, like Georges Braque and Picasso's Cubist period, where sometimes you look at it, you're like, what am I even looking at?
Yeah.
Sometimes it had like those angular lines in some of her paintings. And I'll put a bunch of them on my website, claudinehemingway.com, when we have, of a lot of the stuff that she did. But it was at that point that she was over at the Bateau Lavoir, and there was a party, and Gertrude and Leo Stein were there. And at that time, they had just been in Paris for a few years, and they really started collecting art, as we've talked about Gertrude before. And so she, she basically was able to get in through them. Henri Pierre Rocher was the first one that brokered a deal with Gertrude and Leo Stein to sell the Picassos, some of his first paintings, to Gertrude and Leo Stein. And then they were actually, he actually worked on it to get one of her early paintings. It was the first painting she ever sold. She sold to Gertrude Stein.
I had no idea.
Yeah. So they had, she she ended up getting involved with Rocher. He was a very odd fellow. Like, he had the movie Jules and Jim was based on the book he wrote, and it was like semi-autobiographical, but he wrote a bunch of other things that were also kind of odd. He had very strange practices in his life, we shall say, in his love life. But they were involved for a short period of time, and then she left and moved on from him, and that is when she met Guillaume Apollinaire, who was the poet and art critic. But at the time, Rocher was also, they stayed friends after their love affair ended. And he was a huge proponent for female artists, again, at a time where, they still weren't, going back even before that to Bart Morisot and a lot of these other ladies, Suzanne Valadon. They didn't really get they didn't get the accolades. They didn't get to be shown in the same way that, the men were, of course. And so Rocher and Bert Weil, who we've talked about as well, they really worked together but he would put together some of these other women artists like Suzanne Valadon, and they would be displayed in Bert Weil's gallery.
Oh, wow.
She had her very first solo show by herself. Clovis Sagot in 1907 was a gallery owner on Rue Laffitte, which is where it seemed at one period in time, pretty much Rue Laffitte there below Montmartre was basically just where all the galleries and all of the artists, you could just most likely just find them walking down the street any given day. But it was the very first solo exhibit that she had, and it was there that is when she get to meet a lot of the other artists like Rousseau and Delauney, and all of these other artists came to see her. And so they were all talking about her, which is just not something that they did for women artists at all, sadly. So their relationship ended after a year. And then, of course, she met Apollinaire. And that's kind of how she's mostly known. Most people know her as the muse of Apollinaire. And so, we've talked about all these people before, like with Martha Gellhorn, and she never wanted to be, the postscript in the Hemingway story is that she was the wife of Hemingway. She never wanted to be remembered as that. Of course, like, they're amazing women in their own right, but unfortunately most people know Marie as this muse, not even as her name, the muse of Apollinaire. Sadly. So at the time when she met Apollinaire, he was struggling. He was a writer. He worked, I think it was like he basically worked at like the La Poste. And so he would just sit there and he would be writing and as a poet. Then he kind of just started out as an art critic because he was hanging around all these guys. He was one of the ones that basically coined the term cubist. And so he was, talking about all these artists. And so then he met Marie. And then they became involved. And then as soon as they met, it was like the beginning of this prolific period of time for him. So she definitely was his muse. Henri Rousseau painted a painting of the two of them, and it's called Apollinaire and his Muse.
Always the muse.
And so she is just standing there. She's kind of has her right hand up and kind of has like her finger up, like, like, oh, I have an idea. That's kind of how she's depicted in this painting, because that's what she really was for him, which is great. I mean, anybody wants to be a muse, like in the greatest movie ever, Xanadu. But but she, she was always known as this muse, but, she really was amazing in and of her own. The painting that she had sold to Gertrude Stein, that first one, it was a group painting, and it was a painting of Picasso. Picasso's seated in the center, and then it's Marie's in it, and Fernande Olivier and Apollinaire. And that's a painting that she bought. She also did a second version of sort of that same painting, but it was of Apollinaire, and he was surrounded by all these people, including Marie and Picasso. And she ended up actually doing a second copy of that she did as a gift for Apollinaire down the road. But, the two of them, they had this very strange relationship at the same time. They both each lived with their mother. Both of their mothers were basically, they didn't know who their fathers were. Their mothers did not like either one of them, like the other person. So their relationship didn't go very far. In 1911, Apollinaire was arrested because of the Mona Lisa.
What happened to him? He stole it?
No. So what he did is he went to the police because he had this friend of his that would actually steal things from the Louvre, and he would steal like little statuettes and primitive pieces, things that the Louvre that now aren't in the Louvre. They're now like the Quai Branly, and so this guy would just go in there and just steal things, and then he try to sell them to people. And so like one time he gave one of these to Picasso, and then he would like sometimes just give these things to Apollinaire. And so they hear that the Mona Lisa is stolen. So Apollinaire and Picasso thought, well, we should go tell the police about, Joe or whatever his name was. And, like, go find this guy. He steals things from the Louvre all the time. And so they go there and they actually arrested both Apollinaire and Picasso at the time. And then Picasso basically gets out, quickly that, he's not a part of it, but they decide to keep Apollinaire there. So they kept Apollinaire there for a few days. Picasso kind of just was like, yeah, like you're on your own, buddy. And so after, Apollinaire, they figured out like he had nothing to do with this. They eventually released him, but his mother was not very happy with him. His mother basically was like, you're not coming back here. At this point, Marie was kind of like, they were kind of on the skids as it was before this, but then she kind of was like, I'm kind of done with this too. He ended up moving in with Robert Delauney, he lived right next to where Picasso would later move during the war on the Rue des Grands Augustins. He lived there for a short period of time. And so their relationship was kind of, waning. In 1913, he wrote Le Pont Merbeau, which was a poem about basically their love and their love affair and how, they know it's leaving. But it's this very, very famous poem. And of course, it's named after the bridge that's there at the, past the Eiffel Tower. But in he still held out hope that they were going to get back together. But in 1914, she ended up getting married, and that's when he decided, I guess this is probably over with.
I think once she's married, maybe that's what it is. Also, I love how he tried to do the right thing with the Mona Lisa, and they arrested him.
I know, they were just like, wait a minute, like, you must be behind this. So they arrested him, and that kind of ruined his friendship with Picasso too at that point, because Picasso's just like, see you later, buddy.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, they still share, they still send each other letters. When Apollinaire ended up fighting in World War I, that's where he actually got injured. Some shrapnel went through his helmet and basically into his head. And I saw, actually, they had the helmet on display at this exhibit at the Musée de l'Armée, which was all about Picasso and the war. And so they actually had the helmet on display. They had he ended up surviving that, but definitely didn't, he died in 1918. But it definitely, cut his life short. But there was like these drawings that Picasso did of like Apollinaire with like blood coming out of his head.
Oh my gosh.
But it was interesting that I thought it was really strange that they still had this helmet and you could see this huge hole in it. But I mean, usually you don't think like things like that really survive. But so after they split up, she was still talking to Rocher. He ended up working and still helping her get some commissions. And in 1913, he introduced her to Paul Rosenberg. And Paul Rosenberg was the fantastic art dealer that had a gallery on Rue de la Boîtier. And next door, he ended up putting Picasso up. And Picasso had a studio right next door because he was basically like his sole client at one point. And so this way he could keep an eye on Picasso. Picasso was known of painting extremely fast, but he would sometimes, just kind of go through these bouts where he didn't want to paint. And so Paul was there to keep nudging him. But he also took on Marie. And so she would be hanging in his gallery right there next to Picasso and George Braque and all these other people, which was pretty amazing when you think about it.
Really amazing, yeah.
Yeah, but later on, Rosenberg ends up, this is pre-World War I, so World War II gets a lot different when it comes to the Rosenberg, sadly. But on June 21st, 1914, she married Baron Otto von Watschen, and he was German and a baron, of course. And so she became a baroness, and it's 1914. So 1914 is the beginning of World War I. And being now baroness and married to a German is not going to work very well in your advantage to be in France, even in World War I. World War II is obvious. World War I also, it wasn't a good idea.
Whoops.
Yeah, so they went on a honeymoon in Spain. And while they were there, they realized they can't go back. And her husband was a pacifist, and he was like, I am not going back, and I'm not going to be fighting for the French. Like, he just didn't believe in fighting in war at all. He didn't want to fight against her. He just didn't want to fight at all. So she was just like, well, we can't go back, because we're also German. And so they had to stay in Spain. And when she was young, like most artists at the time, and especially as a woman, she would spend her days in the Louvre when she was younger. And she would go in there, and of course she'd be doing copies and, just basically learning how to paint from these masters. And the one painting that she redid over and over was Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun, and it was her portrait of herself and her daughter. And it's the one we talked about before where her mouth was open a little bit. You could see her teeth, and it was like shock to everybody because you didn't paint, a woman with like her mouth open. So, and it was considered the first, smile in Western art. But so when she was in Spain, and so now she's down there, she can't leave. She would go to the Prado and basically do the same thing. And she'd go in there, and she'd be copying, the Goya and the Grecos. And so that's what she spent most of her time doing. But it was also a pretty prolific time because all she could really do at that time was paint.
That's so cool. I mean, it was kind of like the first lockdown for us.
Exactly. That's why I think like there's already, like the Hockney piece that he did that's at the Musée de l'Orangerie until Valentine's Day, where it's this huge thing called A Year in Normandy. And he basically did it during lockdown on his iPad. And it's this amazing thing. So it's going to be really cool to see what artists, what they come out with because of the lockdown, because what else was there to do?
A podcast. That's what there was to do.
Yeah. So, but she learned that the Apollinaire died. He died on November 9th, 1918. And she was, quite devastated by that, even though, I think she was always, they always had a great love, even though maybe they weren't so great together. But she eventually returned to Paris in 1921. Her marriage ended quickly. They just didn't, during that time together in Spain, like a lot of people are, either people got closer or now they're getting a divorce.
It was a stressful time
because of lockdown. But she returned back to Paris. And when she did in 1921, that was basically, the height. This was, she comes back. Rocher ended up helping her out. He was able to get her some other exhibits. with Paul Rosenberg, she did a whole exhibit in New York. So she was now, known in, across the pond in the United States, and sold quite a few paintings. She also was on display at the Salon des Indépendants. So she was actually pretty huge in the 1920s. And she was also being commissioned for portraits. And she definitely was she didn't hold back her opinion on things. And so if there was things she didn't want to do, she just kind of didn't do them. Even though now she was becoming quite wealthy, she was definitely able to completely support herself on her art. I'm sure there was a little of the, sticking that in her mom's face, but she, she ended up becoming, very, she could completely sustain herself with her art. But then, she also really despised those like society people, and like the tout Paris is what they, at that period, the all of Paris, where, they were just basically out and about and flaunting their wealth. And, it's a lot now how you certain places you go in Paris, that's the C and B scene kind of thing.
Yeah.
And she just really didn't like that, because she just is like, there's no substance to those people. Like, well, this is ridiculous. But at the same time, she was getting commissioned to paint their portraits. So she had to kind of, suck it up and do that anyway. So she was getting, paid to do this. But she would still do it in the way that she wanted. So she would not paint a portrait of somebody in the way that they wanted to be depicted. She would paint them in the way that she saw them. So she, would kind of just like, this was her way. The faces on paintings were almost always very close. They all resembled each other. There wasn't a whole lot of differentiation. She ended up getting commissioned by one woman, the name I don't like to say, Coco Chanel. She she was commissioned. Coco paid her to do a painting of her, and she did it. And she's sitting there, she's holding a cigarette, and there's a dog in the painting. And after she was finished, she gave it to her, and she refused to pay her for it. She said she thought she looked horrible, and she wouldn't pay her for it.
Oh my gosh.
And that painting's now, it's in the Musée de l'Orangerie. It's in the Paul Guillaume collection. They ended up buying it. And actually it's because Coco would always, she would be photographed a lot, but it was only because like it was photo shoots that she set up. And so it was with this filter, not the filter like we use today on Instagram and everything else, but she would make sure that her image was only with how she wanted to see it.
Yeah.
So she, so here she is, Marie paints this painting of her, which she thought, this is how I see you. And Coco didn't like it. But apparently she did that with a lot of artists. Like she would commission these paintings and then do it. And then she was like, no, I don't like it. I'm not going to pay you.
Oh my gosh, that's so crappy, especially since how rich she was.
Exactly. So now you can see that painting at the Orangerie. And actually it was just because it doesn't, she just looks so, she just looks mean in every painting or every picture you see of her. She just does not look like a nice person. And this one actually, like, you wouldn't really know it was her unless you looked at the plaque and saw her name. But she was getting commissioned for these all the time. She preferred to paint mostly just women. She ended up having a very long-term relationship with Nicole Groot, who was a woman. And so she was very fluid with her sexuality. She liked to paint women mostly, but it was because she said she just liked pretty things. And she's like, why would I want to paint a picture of a beer stein when I could paint a picture of a beautiful woman?
I like that.
So she, when she was little, she would find beads and ribbons and stuff, and she would always squirrel these things away and stick them in her pocket and save them because she just liked pretty things. The biggest thing about her paintings that you will always notice is the colors. And there's pretty much most of them that I've seen are all with pinks and like light pink and light blue and gray and white, and a little bit of black, like black lines, but that's pretty much it. She said early on that she hated the color red. I gasped at that. I was like, oh, that's horrible. But she said she hated the color red and the color yellow. Later on in her life, she would use those colors sometimes, but most of the time everything is like the pink and gray and blue.
Oh, that's funny. She didn't like red.
Yeah, so you definitely see like her paintings all kind of have this very kind of airy, dreamlike kind of a feel to them. They're really very pretty, and they're just, it's like, it's women, little girls, but you don't, like you see two women together and they're just sitting, they have them sitting there. There's one in the Orangerie that's with horses, and these women are like dancing around these horses. But they're really, really neat. And there's actually there's a huge auction coming up, I think at the beginning of December, the Karl Lagerfeld's, lots of his personal things. And there's one of her paintings is in that collection.
Oh, cool.
Which is kind of cool. But, she basically, she spent most of this time during the war. She ended up leaving at first during World War II. She left at first going to the Atlantic coast, but she returned back in 1940 with her lover, Nicole. And then she basically was like friends with the German artists that were still in, there's German artists that had come into Paris because it was, safe for them to come. Under the occupation. And so she was actually friends with a lot of these other artists, and ended up becoming friends with some of the German officers. And they would go out to Tour d'Argent and the Grand Vefour and all of these big restaurants. But then her friend Max Jacob, the poet that was, friends with Picasso, he was Jewish. He tried to actually, he actually renounced his Judaism and became Christian. But that didn't satisfy them. She ended up arresting him, and then she tried to do everything she could to save him. And so she, had reached out to one of her German contacts, and then once they were kind of like, wait a minute, what are you doing? Like, why would you want to save him? He's a Jew. And so then she decided to step back because she didn't want to put herself in a bad light. So poor, Max ended up actually, dying in a prison camp just on the, like, basically right before the end of the war. But she ended up actually afterwards, she ended up getting arrested. And because they, as a collaborator, and she ended up having a trial. She was arrested, and she basically, at the last moment, they basically just dropped everything and let her go. But she was almost, tried and convicted of being a collaborator in the war because she had been friends with these German artists and officers.
That's horrible.
Yeah. But her paintings, during the war, because the Nazis and Goering were so known for all of this, stealing all of this stuff. But some of her paintings were considered degenerate. So, basically anything of like the Cubist period, that was all degenerate art, and Hitler hated that. So some of her pieces were taken and they were actually sent, because Goering, who was like the main guy, was coming to Paris doing all the shopping that, the greatest woman in history, Rose Valland, was trying to thwart any effort he was doing. But he did like some of the degenerate art. So there were some of her paintings that he actually saved, even though Hitler thought they were all getting destroyed. He saved them and had them in his own collection. And then luckily all of those were returned because of Rose Valland.
Oh, that's great. We love Rose.
We love Rose. But, she ended up getting, saved, and, she didn't end up getting convicted, and she didn't get, they were taking these women and shaving their head. And some of them, that should have happened to Coco Chanel, but, Winston, she had enough money to buy people off that wouldn't happen to her. But at that point, after that, Marie decided to basically just kind of get out of the public eye. She ended up, moving to Meudon, which is just right outside of Paris, which is also where Rodin lived and has his other museum. But she ended up going out there. She took with her the daughter of her old housekeeper, Suzanne Moreau. And she was the daughter of this housekeeper that had been with Marie since the 1920s. And she was older. She was 49 years old. And at the time, Marie was in her early 70s. And so Marie adopted this woman when she was 49 years old.
49.
Yeah. I don't think you could do that anymore. I think there's an age limit on adoption. I don't know. But she was told to do this because she didn't have any heirs. She didn't have any family left. And so she, was quite, she had a lot of money. She sold a lot of paintings. She was very, prolific in everything that she did. So somebody suggested that, so that she could get everything of yours, when you write your will, you should adopt her. So she adopted this girl at 49 years old.
Wow, that was nice of her.
Yeah, and there's some stories that I found in my research that maybe they were actually involved, which then makes it really weird.
Yeah, I was going to say, maybe they were lovers.
They were lovers, and then she adopted her, which then it's like, what? That's kind of strange. But she ended up adopting her on June 8th, 1956, at 72 years old. Marie had a heart attack at their home. That she had an apartment that just right out the Champ Mars by the Eiffel Tower. She ended up dying there in the home of a heart attack. And Suzanne, of course, she got to keep everything. And later on, Suzanne ended up selling most of it at an auction right before she died. But when Marie, she had requested that she be buried at Père Lachaise, and she be buried close to Apollinaire. And she said that she had to be wearing a white dress, and in her hand she would be holding a red rose, and laying on her heart was a love letter from Apollinaire.
So she always loved him.
I know. I love that part. That when I read the whole thing, I was like, oh, that's my favorite part. I think that's just really sweet.
So romantic.
And then you think of what it probably looks like now, and then it's not. Then it grosses me out. Yeah, but Suzanne ended up, they sold all these, this huge collection of hers at auction. And there was a wealthy taxi magnate, Japanese taxi magnate named Mashiro Takano, and he bought up a majority of her paintings. And in 1983, he opened the first museum dedicated to a female painter, the Musée Marie Laurencin. And sadly, it closed in 2011 for financial reasons. But he had another museum open in 2017, and that's where most of those paintings are. It's not just dedicated to her anymore, but it was just 1983 was the very first museum in the world dedicated to a female artist.
That's insane. It wasn't until the 80s?
Yeah, I mean, that's not that long ago.
No, I mean, when you think about it, it's not that surprising. Women had come pretty far pretty quickly.
Yeah. I mean, now we have the Musée, Camille Claudel, and there's a lot of other museums. But it is too bad that isn't around anymore. But in 2014, two of her paintings, she kind of made her name kind of came back in vogue because two of her paintings were found to be created by this master copyist, and he came out and it found out that they were trying to be sold, and then they finally found out that they were copies, and it was this huge story. So then that's when a lot of people kind of started to hear about her. And so, and then there was a Joe Dassin song that he sings about her. But, most people see her name because, if you are looking at the Apollinaire poem and then you see her name there. So it's kind of sadly far down the list as far as her being an artist. And she had all of these crazy relationships, and I kind of didn't even go into all of them because it's also like, I don't want to add to the story of it. Her, she's just remembered as all these crazy relationships. It's more because she also it should be because she was this amazing artist.
Yeah, because a lot of the male artists had crazy relationships too, but no one really talks about that. They're just like, he was a womanizer.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. With Picasso and Rodin. But, she had, she had quite the life, 72 years. And there's just a ton of paintings. Again, there's a handful of them at the Orangerie. There's also some at the Pompidou. That's where you could see the one of Guillaume Apollinaire around his friends. And those earlier ones are darker colors. It was later on when she started in all of the pastel. And those paintings, when you see them, they would remind you a lot of Jacqueline Marvell, who we will talk about soon too, that our wonderful friend Camille is doing everything she can for her memory of Jacqueline Marvell. But they definitely, like when I first saw those, I thought they were Marvell's.
Interesting.
Yeah. But they are pretty neat. I mean, they're very soft. They're very pastel. They're very dreamy and airy. They look like the kind of paintings you would put in a little girl's room. And I don't mean that in a bad way.
I need to check out her work now. I'm inspired.
Yeah, that's really great. And she definitely was a woman that, kind of, a lot of these women we talk about, thankfully, all were kind of outspoken and kind of just, marched to their own tune and didn't do what they thought society wanted them to do, which is kind of awesome.
Yeah, we love those badass women.
Yes.
Well, thank you guys for tuning in to another episode. And don't forget to join Claudine every weekend as she does live virtual tours of Paris. You can walk live with her around Paris, see Paris, and listen to history as she chats with you over Zoom. So contact Claudine to learn more about that, ClaudineHemingway.com, and make sure you tune in next week.
Thank you for listening to Paris History Avec a Hemingway. If you want to find out some more, you could always find me on my Instagram page, Claudine Bleu Blanc Rouge, and that's BLEU, as in the French way to spell it. And each day I post a daily history lesson about a person or a place or something in Paris, or it's lots of fun facts. And then also at ClaudineHemingway.com, where you can also sign up for my newsletter there.